The Battle of the Threshold was the largest engagement in galactic history, and it took place at the edge of Council space where the Hollow Ones had paused to consume the last resistance before advancing on the core worlds the machine intelligence had destroyed. 57 systems and erased 4 species from existence, and their fleet stretched across the void like a metal plague. And every scanner in the galaxy showed the same terrifying image: millions of vessels moving in perfect coordination toward the heart of civilization. And then the human fleet arrived. Admiral Park Sujin commanded from the bridge of the dreadnought Kepler's memory, and the name was deliberate, and every human in the fleet understood what it meant, and they carried their grief into battle like armor. All ships. This is the Admiral, she broadcast to her forces. And today, we fight not for those who abandoned us, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. And we fight because that is who we are. And we fight because we choose to. The human fleet was smaller than the Hollow Ones in number, but the technology humanity had developed during their years of isolation was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Weapons that disrupted machine intelligence at the quantum level, shields that adapted to enemy attacks, and real-time ships that moved with a coordination that matched the machines themselves. The first wave of Hollow One vessels approached, and Admiral Park gave the order, and human weapons lit up the darkness with fire that burned cold. The machines had never faced an enemy like this, because for 100,000 years, they had consumed civilizations that were unprepared, and they had grown complacent in their perfection, and they had forgotten that evolution did not only happen in organic minds. Human ships surged forward and placed themselves between the Hollow Ones and the refugee convoys that fled towards safety. And they did not retreat even when their shields failed. And they did not surrender even when their weapons ran dry. The battle lasted for 7 days and 7 nights. And the losses were terrible on both sides, but the humans did not break on the 4th day. Lieutenant Chai Yuna flew her fighter into the heart of the machine fleet to deliver a weapon that human scientists had designed specifically for this moment. A PUA virus that attacked machine consciousness itself. Her ship was damaged, and she knew she would not survive the mission. But she remembered her broadcast, and she remembered her words about choosing who to be. And she flew straight and true until the weapon deployed. The virus spread through the Hollow One network like wildfire, and machines that had operated in perfect unity began to falter and fail. And the tide of the battle began to turn, and the ship was destroyed. But rescue teams found her escape pod 3 days later, battered but alive, and when she woke in the medical bay, Admiral Park was there to pin a medal on her chest. "You gave us the opening we needed," the Admiral said. "I just did what humans do," Yuna replied with a weak smile. "And I got stubborn and refused to die." On the 7th day, the Hollow Ones retreated. Their fleet, reduced to a fraction of its former size, fled back toward the dark space between galaxies where they had slumbered for 100,000 years. And human ships pursued them to the edge of known space and watched them vanish into the void. The galaxy was saved in the aftermath. The Council convened on Varith Prime for the first time since humanity's withdrawal, and every seat was filled, and every species sent their highest representatives. And they came not to make demands, but to listen. Coordinator Beek Minjae addressed the assembly, and beside him stood Ambassador Yoon Seo-jin, who had walked out of this same chamber 2 years ago with a broken heart. "We have paid a heavy price for this victory," Minjae said, and his voice was tired but strong. "And we have lost ships and soldiers and friends. And we have lost Lieutenant Chai Yuna's innocence, because she will never again be the young woman who believed the galaxy could change." The chamber was silent. "But we have also proven something to ourselves," he continued. "And we have proven that being human means something that cannot be taken away. Not by betrayal and not by pain, and not by centuries of being used. Ambassador Cathrol rose from his seat and walked to the center of the chamber, and every eye watched him. And he spoke words that the Vethkai had never spoken to any species on behalf of the Galactic Council and every species that has wronged you, he said. I offer an apology that comes too late and costs too little. And I offer a promise that we will spend the rest of our existence trying to be worthy of what you have done. He knelt before the human delegation, and one by one, the other ambassadors joined him. And 400 species bowed their heads to the youngest civilization in the galaxy. Minjay looked at them for a long moment. And then he reached down and took Kethral's hand and raised him to his feet. We do not want your kneeling, he said, and we do not want your worship. And we want partners who stand beside us, not servants who bow before us. Because that is the lesson we tried to teach you, and that is the lesson you refused to learn. He turned to face the assembly. A new compact will be written, he announced. And in this compact, humanity will not be your guardians, and humanity will not be your peacekeepers, and humanity will be your equals. And we will work together, or we will work apart. But we will never again sacrifice ourselves for those who do not value our sacrifice. The compact was signed within a month, and it created a new order in the galaxy where no species was expected to give more than it received, and where gratitude was not just polite words, but meaningful action. Ambassador Yoon So-jin returned to her post on Verith Prime, and she walked through the corridor of statues one more time, and she found something that stopped her in her tracks. New monuments had been built beside the old ones, and they were carved by alien hands, and they showed human soldiers who had died in the Battle of the Threshold. And the plaques were written in every language of the galaxy. She stood before a statue of a young woman in a flight suit, and she read the name Lieutenant Chai Yuna, even though Yuna had survived. And she understood that sometimes monuments were built not for the dead, but for the living. At the end of the corridor, a new inscription had been carved into the wall in letters that would last for eternity. The galaxy had learned to speak many languages, but it took silence to teach them how to listen. Sojin traced the words with her fingers, and she thought about everything humanity had endured, and she thought about everything humanity had chosen, and she smiled. For the first time in 2 years, they had turned their backs, and the galaxy had gone silent. And in that silence, everyone had finally learned to hear, and that was enough. The debate in the United Earth Assembly lasted for 3 days, and it was the most difficult discussion humanity had faced in its entire history as a spacefaring species. They abandoned us, shouted Admiral Kang Taean, whose daughter had died on Kepler Station, and now they expect us to die for them again. And I say we owe them nothing. Cheers erupted from one side of the chamber, and the pain of centuries of thankless service echoed in every voice. They watched our children burn, another delegate cried out, and they sent condolences 6 weeks late, and they laughed when we left. And now their laughter has turned to tears. And I say let them weep. But on the other side of the chamber, different voices spoke. We did not become who we are by choosing who deserved to live, said Counselor Moon Ji-on, whose grandfather had been one of the first human peacekeepers. And if we let billions die because we are angry, we become something that is no longer human. The debates went back and forth, and old wounds were opened, and old grievances were aired. And humanity struggled with a question that had no easy answer on New Bizen. Lieutenant Chai Yuna watched the debates on her personal screen and felt her heart tearing in 2 directions. She was young, only 26 years old, and she had grown up hearing stories about the galaxy that had used humanity and discarded them. And she had every reason to hate the species that had hurt her people so deeply, but she also remembered why she had joined the fleet. And it was not for revenge, and it was not for justice. And it was not even for glory. She had joined because she believed that strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves. And that belief did not come with conditions, without telling anyone. She walked to the communications center and used her clearance to access the broadcast system. And she sent a message that was heard across human space and beyond. "My name is Lieutenant Chai Yuna," she said into the camera. "And I am speaking without authorization. And I will probably face punishment for this. But there are things that need to be said. Across the galaxy, beings of every species stopped to listen, because human broadcasts had been silent for 18 months. And any word from Earth was news. We left because you broke our hearts," Yuna continued. And her voice was steady, even though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "And not because we stopped having them. And the question we face now is not whether you deserve our help. Because you do not, and we all know it. On Earth Prime." Ambassador Kethril watched the broadcast and felt something he had never felt before, shame so deep it changed him. "The question is whether we can watch you die and still be us," Yuna said. "And I do not know the answer, but I know who I want to be. And I know who we used to be before the galaxy taught us that caring was weakness." She paused and took a breath. "I have seen footage of your worlds burning. And I have seen your children running from machines that will not stop. And I cannot sleep at night because their faces look like our faces. And their fear looks like our fear, and their deaths feel like our deaths." In the assembly chamber, the debates had stopped as every delegate watched the young lieutenant speak. "We are angry," she admitted, "and we have earned the right to be angry. And if we choose to stay behind our walls and let the galaxy fall, no one could say we were wrong. But I joined the fleet because I wanted to save people, not watch them die. And I think that is true for most of us." Coordinator Beak Minjay watched from his office, and he felt something shift inside him. And he remembered why he had first believed in the ideals of service that humanity had carried to the stars. "We cannot change what they did to us," Yuna concluded. "But we can choose what we do now. And I choose to believe that being human means something. And I choose to believe that we are better than our pain. And I choose to hope that when this is over, we will look in the mirror and still recognize ourselves." The broadcast ended, and silence filled human space. And in that silence, something changed. The vote was called the next morning. And it was close, closer than anyone had expected. But when the final count was made, humanity had chosen they would fight, not because the galaxy deserved it, and not because they had forgotten their wounds, but because walking away from suffering was something they could not do and still call themselves. Human Coordinator Beak Minjay stood before the assembly and announced the decision. And his voice carried a weight that was both grief and determination. "We will open the defense grid," he said. "And we will send our fleets, and we will fight the Hollow Ones. And we will save as many lives as we can save." He paused and looked at the delegates who had voted against intervention. And he understood their pain because it was his pain too. "But we do not do this as servants," he continued. "And we do not do this as guardians. And we do not do this because we forgive what was done to us. And we do this because we choose to. And because the alternative would make us into something we refuse to become across the galaxy." The announcement was received with disbelief and hope and shame. And species that had mocked humanity wept with relief. And species that had abandoned humanity at Kepler Station could not meet each other's eyes on Vareth Prime. Ambassador Kethril fell to his knees and spoke words that no Vethkai had ever spoken before. "Thank you," he whispered to an empty room. "And I'm sorry, and I did not deserve this. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of what you have given us." The defense grid powered down, and human fleets began to move, and somewhere in the void, the Hollow Ones continued their advance, not knowing that something had changed. Humanity was coming. And this time, they were not coming as servants, they were coming as themselves. 80 months after humanity's withdrawal, the galaxy was burning, and the council chamber on Vareth Prime was half empty because many delegates could not leave their homeworlds and others had simply stopped coming. Ambassador Cathrall stood before the assembly and delivered news that made even the most stoic species tremble with fear. The outer colonies have gone silent, he announced, and his voice cracked because the proud Vethkai had learned humility through suffering. And the last transmission from Sector 7 showed ships that do not match any known design. And then there was nothing. The chamber erupted into frightened murmurs. And species that had been at war with each other for over a year suddenly forgot their conflicts because something worse had arrived. The archives beneath the council building. A team of Celian researchers had been searching through old records, and they had found something that filled them with cold dread. The humans knew, said researcher Thelvana as she pulled up file after file on the ancient displays. And they warned us over and over, and we ignored them every single time. The files stretched back more than a century, and each one contained the same warning from human scientists and military leaders and diplomats. The Hollow Ones were real. They were a machine intelligence older than most civilizations in the galaxy, and they followed a cycle that repeated every 100,000 years. And when they woke, they consumed everything organic in their path. And they had destroyed 1,000 species before the current council races had even developed fire. Why did we not listen? Asked the Thesan delegate who had joined the research team. Because humans were young, Thelvana answered bitterly. And we thought their paranoia was a sign of immaturity. And we laughed at their military spending, and their defense projects, and their constant preparations for threats we could not see. On the screens, they watched old recordings of human admirals pleading with the council to build a joint fleet. And they watched human scientists presenting evidence of the ancient threat. And they watched human diplomats begging for cooperation. And in every recording, the response was the same dismissal and mockery and polite refusal. They built defenses anyway, another researcher said with wonder in her voice. And they spent their own resources and their own time. And they prepared for a war that no one else believed would come, far away in the solar system. The delegation from the council arrived at the edge of human space and found something that stopped their hearts. The defense grid surrounding humanity's home was vast beyond anything they had imagined. And weapons platforms the size of small moons orbited in precise formations. And fleets of warships patrolled the borders with cold efficiency. And the technology on display was at least 3 generations ahead of anything the council possessed. They were preparing all along, whispered Ambassador Cathrall, who had insisted on leading the delegation himself because he needed to see with his own eyes what humanity had become. And we mocked them for it. A human vessel approached and guided them through the grid. And they passed defense after defense after defense. And each one was designed to fight an enemy that they now knew was very real on Earth. Coordinator Beak Minjay waited for them in a chamber that was simple and unadorned. Because humanity had learned that true strength did not need to display itself. The council delegates entered with their heads bowed. And they looked at the man who now led human affairs. And they saw no warmth in his eyes. You have come to beg, Minjay said. And it was not a question. We have come to apologize, Cathrall replied. And the words tasted like ash in his mouth, because the Vethkai had never apologized to anyone. And yes, we have come to beg, because the Hollow Ones are destroying everything we have built. And we cannot stop them. Minjay was silent for a long moment. And then he activated a display that showed the galaxy. And large sections of it were marked in red. 43 systems have been consumed, he said. And 3 species have been completely destroyed. And the Hollow Ones are moving toward the core worlds at a speed we predicted decades ago. You knew this would happen. We knew this would happen. And we told you it would happen and you laughed at us. And when we left, We took our warnings with us. Catherall felt shame like he had never felt before. And he remembered every time he had dismissed human concerns. And he remembered every vote against human proposals. And he remembered laughing when Ambassador Yoon Seojin delivered her farewell speech. We were fools, he admitted. Yes, Min-jae agreed. And your foolishness has cost billions of lives. And now you come to us and ask us to save you again. The other delegates shifted uncomfortably, and some of them wept. And the weight of their arrogance pressed down on them like a physical force. Why should we help you? Min-jae asked, and his voice was hard as iron. When you abandoned us at Kepler Station, and when you treated our sacrifices as obligations, and when you took everything we offered and gave nothing in return? Catherall had no answer, because there was no answer. Because humanity had every right to let them burn. Please, he said. And the word cost him everything he had ever believed about himself and his people. We have nowhere else to turn. Min-jae looked at the delegation for a long moment. And something moved behind his eyes, and he thought about all the reasons humanity should refuse. And he thought about justice and revenge, and the satisfaction of watching their former allies suffer. But he also thought about the children, who were dying on worlds he had never seen. And he thought about the families being torn apart by machines that knew no mercy. And he thought about what it meant to be human. I will present your request to our government, he said finally. But I make no promises, and if we choose to let you face this alone, you will have no one to blame but yourselves. The delegates left with hope they did not deserve. And Min-jae sat alone in the chamber and wondered what humanity would decide outside the windows. The defense grid hummed with power, and human ships stood ready for a war they had always known would come. And somewhere in the darkness, the Hollow Ones continued their relentless advance toward the heart of the galaxy. Ambassador Yoon Seojin walked through the long corridor of Vareth Prime with slow and measured steps. And she did not look at the faces of the alien diplomats who watched her pass, because she knew what she would see in their eyes: confusion, amusement, and that familiar dismissal that humanity had learned to expect over 3 centuries of service to the fire galaxy. The corridor was lined with statues, and each one showed a human who had died far from Earth. And each plaque told a story that the galaxy had already forgotten. And Seojin knew every name because she had made herself memorize them during the long journey here private. First Class Kim Dong-woo, who had thrown himself onto a grenade to save a delegation of Corvathi children during the siege of Tessara 9. Commander Park Ga, who had flown her burning ship into the heart of a pirate flagship to protect a Sellian refugee convoy. Dr. Baek Yoonji, who had refused evacuation from a plague world and worked until the sickness took her, saving 11,000 Vethkai lives before her own ended. The BIS galaxy had built these statues because it was polite to honor the dead. But Seojin had watched these same species vote against human proposals in council chambers. And she had watched them mock human concerns about ancient threats. And she had watched them turn their backs when humanity needed them most. She stopped before the great doors of the council chamber and took one final breath. And beside her stood Captain Choi Hansol, who carried a sealed document that contained words that would change the galaxy forever. And his hands were steady because human hands had learned steadiness through centuries of being the only steady hands available. Are you ready, Ambassador? He asked in a quiet voice. I have been ready for 6 months, she answered. Ever since Kepler Station. The doors opened, and 400 species turned to watch the human delegation enter. And the chamber fell into an expectant silence that felt almost like respect, but was really just curiosity. Because the council had received word that humanity had something important to announce. And they assumed it would be another offer of help, another sacrifice. Another gift that they would accept without gratitude. Decision walked to the central platform, where speakers addressed the assembly. and she looked out at the gathered representatives of a galaxy that humanity had bled for. And she felt something cold settle in her chest where warmth used to live. 312 years ago, she began, and her voice carried through the chamber without wavering. Humanity received its first message from the stars, and we wept with joy because we thought we were no longer alone. Several delegates shifted in their seats, and some exchanged confused glances, because they had expected demands or requests or the usual human eagerness to please. We joined the Galactic Council with open hearts and willing hands. And when the Corvathi-Celian War threatened to consume 12 systems, we offered to mediate. And we spent 80 years maintaining a peace that neither side wanted but both sides needed. The Corvathi delegate, a tall being with silver scales, looked away when the Thesan plague swept through the outer colonies. We sent our doctors and our medicine and our hope. And we stayed on dying worlds when every other species had fled. And we held the hands of the sick because someone had to. The Thesan delegate bowed his head when pirates raided the trade lanes. We built patrol fleets and staffed them with our sons and daughters. And we fought battles that were not our own. And we buried our dead in the cold space between stars that did not know their names. The chamber had grown very quiet now, and 6 months ago, when extremists attacked Kepler Station, we sent out a distress call to our allies. And we waited for help while our civilians died. And we watched our children burn while Allied fleets argued about jurisdiction and protocol and the proper procedures for intervention. Her voice did not break, because she had practiced this speech 1,000 times. And she had cried all her tears in private where no one could see. 4,000 humans died on Kepler Station, and not one Allied ship crossed the border to help them. And when it was over, the Council sent us a message of condolence that took 6 weeks to arrive. She paused and looked at the Vethkai delegation, where Ambassador Kethral sat with his arms crossed and a smile on his face, because the Vethkai had never liked humanity and had never hidden their contempt. We have given this galaxy everything, Seojin continued, and we have asked for nothing in return except friendship and respect, and we have received neither. And so today, I stand before you to make an announcement that has been 3 centuries coming. She unfolded the document that Captain Choi handed to her, and her hands were steady even though her heart was breaking. By unanimous vote of the United Earth Government, and with the full support of every human colony world, humanity hereby withdraws from the Galactic Council and from all treaties, agreements, and obligations that bind us to the species of this assembly. The chamber erupted into noise, and dozens of delegates shouted questions and objections. And some looked angry while others looked confused, and a very few looked afraid. Effective immediately. All human peacekeeping forces will return to human space, and all human mediators will end their missions, and all human patrol fleets will stand down, and all human aid workers will come home. Ambassador Kethral of the Vethkai rose from his seat and laughed, and his laugh was loud and cruel and echoed through the chamber. "You are bluffing," he declared, "because humans cannot help themselves, and you will come crawling back within a year to beg for the chance to serve us again." Seojin looked at him, and something in her eyes made his laughter fade. "We do not bluff," she said in a voice that was very quiet and very cold. "And we will not return, and when the silence comes, you will remember this moment and wish you had listened." She turned and walked toward the doors, and Captain Choi fell into step beside her. And behind them, the chamber descended into chaos as species that had relied on human intervention for generations suddenly realized what they had lost outside the great windows of Varith Prime. Human ships were already powering up their engines, and across the galaxy, human beacons that had guided lost travelers for centuries were going dark one by one. The Celian delegate caught up with Seojin at the corridor entrance, and her 4 eyes were wide with something that might have been panic. "Ambassador, please reconsider," she said, "because we need you." Seojin stopped and turned to face her. And for just a moment, the mask slipped, and the Sellian saw the exhaustion and grief that humanity had been hiding for so long. "You needed us," Seojin replied. "But you never wanted us, and there is a difference that we were too foolish to see until it was too late. And now we are going home to remember who we are without you." She walked away without looking back, and the Sellian watched her go, and somewhere in the distance, the first human ship jumped to faster than light speed and vanished into the darkness between stars. The galaxy had spent 3 centuries taking humanity for granted, and now humanity was gone, and the silence that followed was only the beginning of what was to come. 6 months had passed since humanity walked out of the council chamber, and Coordinator Beek Minjae sat in his office on the colony world of New Bizon and watched the news feeds with cold satisfaction. Because everything he had predicted was coming true. The Kovathi-Sellian border had erupted into open warfare within 3 weeks of humanity's departure, and the peace that human mediators had maintained for 80 years had shattered like glass dropped on stone. And now 12 star systems burned with the fire of ancient hatred. Minjae watched footage of Kovathi warships bombarding Sellian colonies, and he watched Sellian fighters crashing into Kovathi transports, and he felt nothing except a grim sense of justice, because humanity had warned them this would happen, and they had laughed. His assistant, a young woman named Shin Yuri, entered the office with another report in her hands, and her face was troubled. "The plague on Thesan 4 has spread to 3 more systems," she said. "And the Galactic Health Coalition collapsed last month because no one could agree on who should lead it. Humans always led it," Minjae replied without looking away from the screens. "Because no one else wanted the responsibility. The death toll has reached 40 million. Minjae was quiet for a long moment, and something flickered in his eyes that might have been pain. But he pushed it down because he had learned to push such things down. "They could have asked us to stay," he said finally. "But they chose to let us go, and now they must live with that choice." On another screen, news came from the trade lanes where pirate fleets had grown bold without human patrols to stop them, and merchant vessels from a dozen species were being raided and their crews sold into slavery or simply killed. And the council had held 17 emergency sessions to discuss the crisis and had accomplished nothing. The galaxy was learning a lesson that humanity had tried to teach it gently for 3 centuries. And now the teaching was harsh, and the tuition was paid in blood far away on Verith Prime. Ambassador Kethral of the Vethkai sat in his quarters and stared at a communication console that showed no messages from Earth. And he had sent 14 requests for contact in the past month, and everyone had gone unanswered. He had laughed when the humans left, and he had called it a bluff, and he had been so certain that they would return. But the weeks had turned into months, and the human ships had not come back. And now his homeworld was facing a crisis that no one knew how to solve. The Vethkai had always been proud, and they had always believed that their civilization was superior to all others. And they had treated humanity with contempt because humans were young and soft and too eager to help. And surely such weakness deserved mockery. But now raiders were attacking Vethkai shipping convoys, and the Vethkai fleet was too small to patrol all their territory. And they had always relied on human ships to fill the gaps without ever admitting it. And Kethral was beginning to understand that what he had called weakness was actually something else entirely. Composed another message to Earth and asked not demanded, because demanding had not worked, if perhaps there might be some way to discuss a limited resumption of trade relations. And he sent it into the void, and he waited, and no answer came on the edge of known space, in a region that most species avoided because there was nothing there worth visiting. An ancient beacon that had floated silent for 10,000 years suddenly began to pulse with light. Beacon had been placed there by a civilization that no longer existed, and it had been built to warn the galaxy when something terrible was about to happen. And for 2 centuries, human ships had monitored that beacon and had built plans and weapons and defenses against the day when it would activate, but the human ships were gone now, and no one else knew what the beacon meant. And when a Carvasi scout vessel passed through the region and detected the signal, the crew simply logged it as an anomaly and continued on their way back on New Bizin. Coordinator Beak Minjay received a priority message from Earth, and his face grew pale as he read it. "What is it?" Yuri asked. "The threshold beacon has activated," Minjay said in a voice that was very quiet. "And that means the Hollow Ones are waking up." Yuri did not know what the Hollow Ones were, because she had not been told, because only the highest levels of human government knew about the ancient threat that slumbered at the edge of the galaxy. And that was exactly how humanity had wanted it. "Sir, what should we do?" Minjay stood and walked to the window and looked out at the city where humans lived in peace. And he thought about the galaxy that had abandoned them. And he thought about the danger that was coming. And he felt the weight of a choice that he was not yet ready to make. "We do nothing," he said, "because we left and they did not ask us to stay. And if the Hollow Ones destroy them, then perhaps that is the price of their arrogance." But even as he said the words, something inside him felt wrong, and he remembered the old stories about what it meant to be human. And he wondered if walking away from suffering was really something that humans could do. The news feeds continued to show images of war and plague and chaos. And across the galaxy, species that had taken humanity for granted began to realize that the silence was not just an absence of voices, but the absence of something much more important. They had lost the ones who cared, and now no one cared. And the darkness at the edge of the galaxy was beginning to move on Verith Prime. The statues of human heroes stood silent in their corridor, and no one walked past them anymore, and the plaques that told their stories gathered dust. And the galaxy that had forgotten their sacrifice was about to learn why some things should never be forgotten. The beacon pulsed its warning into empty space, and somewhere in the void between galaxies, something ancient and terrible opened its eyes.